Dr. Sarah Mitchell stepped out of the dusty Land Rover, her boots hitting the red earth of rural Botswana with a soft thud. The year was 1987, and she had been sent by the World Health Organization to investigate reports of a mysterious illness spreading through the remote villages of the Kalahari Desert region. The scorching African sun beat down mercilessly as she surveyed the small settlement of Ganzi, where dozens of families had reported severe respiratory symptoms that didn't match any known disease patterns. The village elder, Gosi Tobogo, approached, her with weathered hands clasped together in greeting. His eyes held a mixture of hope and desperation that Sarah had seen too many times in her career as an epidemiologist. Through her translator, he explained how the sickness had begun 3 months earlier, striking first the children, then spreading to adults with alarming speed. What started as simple coughing had evolved into something far more sinister. Sarah's medical bag felt heavy as she followed Kagosi Tobogo through narrow paths between traditional huts. The silence was unsettling. In a typical village of this size, she should have heard children playing, women chatting as they worked, men discussing the day's plans. Instead, there was an eerie quiet, broken only by occasional fits of violent coughing echoing from behind closed doors. In the first hut they visited, Sarah found 8-year-old Thabo lying on a woven mat, his small chest rising and falling with labored breaths. His mother, Naledi, knelt beside him with tears streaming down her face. She spoke rapidly in Setswana, her voice cracking with emotion. The translator's face grew grim as he relayed her words. She says the boy has been like this for 2 weeks. He can barely eat, can't play with other children. She's lost 2 relatives already to this sickness. Sarah knelt beside the child, her trained eye immediately noting the unusual symptoms. Thabo's breathing was shallow and rapid. His lips showed a slight blue tinge indicating oxygen deprivation, but his fever was relatively low. Most puzzling was the distinctive rash that covered his arms and chest. Small, dark spots that didn't resemble any tropical disease she knew. She gently examined his throat and found severe inflammation, but no sign of the white patches typical of strep throat or diphtheria. As she moved from hut to hut, documenting cases and collecting samples, a disturbing pattern emerged. The illness seemed to affect entire families simultaneously, suggesting either a highly contagious pathogen or environmental contamination. What troubled Sarah most was the timeline described by the villagers. The symptoms had appeared suddenly, almost overnight, in multiple locations across a 50-mile radius. That evening, as Sarah sat in her temporary accommodations reviewing her notes by lamplight, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary outbreak. Her years of experience in Africa had taught her to recognize the fingerprints of various diseases: malaria, tuberculosis, cholera, meningitis. But this constellation of symptoms defied classification. The rapid onset, the specific geographic clustering, and the unusual presentation all pointed to something she had never encountered before. Her satellite phone buzzed with an incoming call from Dr. James Harrison, her supervisor at WHO headquarters in Geneva. His voice crackled through the static. "Sarah, we're getting reports from 3 other countries in the region. Similar symptoms, similar timeline. The CDC in Atlanta is sending a team, and we need you to coordinate the initial response." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine despite the warm evening air. A multi-country outbreak suggested something far more serious than a localized epidemic. As she stared out at the star-filled African sky, she realized she was potentially facing one of the most significant public health emergencies of her career. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on her shoulders as she prepared for what might be a long and difficult battle against an unknown enemy. The next morning would bring new revelations that would change everything she thought she knew about this mysterious illness. But tonight, as the sounds of the African bush surrounded her small tent, Sarah could only listen to the distant coughing that seemed to carry on the wind from village to village, a haunting reminder of the urgent mission ahead. Dawn broke over the Kalahari with its usual spectacular display of orange and gold, but Dr. Sarah Mitchell barely noticed the beauty as she packed her equipment for another day of investigation. The night had brought disturbing news through her: radio communications, 2 more villages had reported similar outbreaks, and the death toll was climbing faster than anyone had anticipated. Her first stop was the small clinic in Ganzi, where Dr. Empo Mogomotsi, the only qualified physician within 100 miles, was struggling to treat an overwhelming number of patients. The usually composed local doctor looked exhausted, his white coat stained with evidence of sleepless nights spent battling an enemy he couldn't identify. "Dr. Mitchell, I'm grateful you're here," he said, his English heavily accented but precise. "In 30 years of practice, I've never seen anything like this. The patients respond to nothing. Not antibiotics, not antivirals, not even supportive care seems to help much. And the progression—" He paused, running a hand over his tired face. "It's unlike anything in my medical training." Sarah followed him through the overcrowded clinic where patients lay on every available surface. The small building, designed to handle routine medical issues for the local population, now resembled a disaster zone. Families huddled together, some praying softly, others maintaining silent vigils over their sick loved ones. The air was thick with the sound of labored breathing and muffled sobs. In the corner, Sarah noticed an elderly woman named Boitumelo, speaking urgently with her adult son. Through her translator, Sarah learned that Boitumelo was one of the village's traditional healers, and she had a theory that was causing considerable debate among the locals. The old woman insisted that the sickness had begun shortly after the arrival of strange men with trucks who had been seen near the water sources several months earlier. She says they wore special suits and took samples from the wells in the river, the translator explained. The village children watched them from a distance, but the men told everyone to stay away. A few weeks after they left, animals started getting sick first, the cattle, then the wild game. Only then did it spread to people. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Environmental contamination could explain the rapid onset and geographic clustering of cases. She immediately began questioning other villagers about these mysterious visitors, and the stories were remarkably consistent. Multiple witnesses described seeing unmarked vehicles, men in protective equipment, and unusual activities around water sources throughout the affected region. Meanwhile, her satellite phone brought updates from the expanding crisis. The CDC team had arrived in the capital, Gaborone, and preliminary lab results from samples shipped to Atlanta were raising more questions than answers. Dr. Lisa Chen, the lead CDC epidemiologist, briefed Sarah via secured communication. "Whatever this is, it's not matching any known pathogen in our databases. The symptoms suggest a possible toxic exposure, but we need environmental samples from ground zero." Sarah's investigation took an unexpected turn when she met with Moses Kelapile, a local government environmental inspector who had been quietly conducting his own investigation. In a private meeting away from the village, Moses revealed information that made Sarah's blood run cold. Several months before the outbreak, his office had received reports of unauthorized drilling activities in the affected areas. But when he arrived to investigate, he found no permits, no official records, and no cooperation from local authorities who claimed to know nothing about the activities. "Dr. Mitchell," Moses said in hushed tones, "I believe someone was conducting illegal mining or waste disposal operations in this region. The timing, the locations, the symptoms, it all points to toxic contamination, but whoever was responsible covered their tracks very well." That evening, Sarah's team made a breakthrough that would change the entire direction of their investigation. While analyzing water samples collected from various sources, they discovered traces of heavy metals and industrial chemicals at levels far above safe limits. The contamination pattern suggested deliberate dumping rather than accidental spillage, and the toxins were consistent with the neurological and respiratory symptoms they were observing in patients. As Sarah compiled her findings for the emergency report to WHO headquarters, she realized they were no longer dealing with a natural disease outbreak, but potentially with an environmental crime of massive proportions. The implications were staggering. If her suspicions were correct, someone had deliberately poisoned the water supply of thousands of innocent people in one of the world's most vulnerable regions. Her hands trembled slightly as she typed the classified report that would trigger international investigations and potentially expose one of the most heinous environmental crimes in African history. Outside her tent, the sounds of the African night seemed more ominous now, as if the very land itself was crying out for justice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as she prepared to confront powerful interests who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried in the red earth of Botswana. The morning sun cast long shadows across the temporary command center that Dr. Sarah Mitchell had established in Gyanzi's community hall. Maps covered every wall, marked with red pins indicating affected areas, while computers hummed with data analysis from samples collected across the region. The arrival of the international response team had transformed the small building into the nerve center of what was rapidly becoming one of Africa's most significant environmental health emergencies. Dr. James Harrison had flown in from Geneva overnight, accompanied by specialists from the European Center for Disease Prevention and Control. His usually calm demeanor showed cracks of tension as he reviewed Sarah's preliminary findings. The evidence of deliberate contamination was mounting, but the political implications were explosive. Botswana had always been considered one of Africa's most stable democracies, and suggesting that foreign actors had conducted illegal operations on their soil could destabilize regional relationships. Sarah, your work has been exemplary, but we need to be extremely careful about our next steps, Harrison warned as they stood before a map showing the contamination spread pattern. The samples clearly show industrial toxins consistent with rare earth mining operations, but accusing anyone without absolute proof could create an international incident. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Keletso Ramphele, a young geology student from the University of Botswana, had been conducting research on groundwater patterns in the region for her thesis. When she heard about the mysterious illness through local radio broadcasts, she made connections that had escaped the international experts. Her undergraduate research had documented unusual seismic activity and changes in groundwater flow that coincided perfectly with the timeline of the contamination. Look at these readings, Keletso explained excitedly, spreading her handwritten charts across the table. 3 months before people got sick, sensitive equipment at the university detected underground explosions in this exact area. I thought it might be illegal diamond mining, but now I think it was something much worse. Her data revealed a systematic pattern of underground disturbance that suggested extensive tunneling and excavation operations. More crucially, her groundwater monitoring had detected chemical changes weeks before the first human cases appeared. The contamination had spread through the underground aquifer system, reaching multiple villages simultaneously when the seasonal rains raised water table levels. Sarah's investigation team, now reinforced with specialists from multiple international agencies, began following paper trails that led far beyond Botswana's borders. Financial records obtained through emergency legal channels revealed a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts linked to rare earth mining operations. The rare earth elements were critical components in modern electronics, from smartphones to military equipment, making them incredibly valuable and highly sought after by both legitimate corporations and criminal organizations. Dr. Lisa Chen from the CDC had been working around the clock to understand the specific health impacts of the contamination. Her findings were deeply troubling. The toxins we've identified don't just cause the immediate respiratory and neurological symptoms, she explained during a secure video conference with officials in Atlanta. Long-term exposure could lead to cancer, birth defects, and permanent organ damage. We're potentially looking at a health crisis that could affect this population for generations. Meanwhile, local communities were growing increasingly desperate and angry. Village meetings that had begun with hope for medical treatment were evolving into demands for answers and accountability. Kagosi Tebogo, the village elder who had first welcomed Sarah, now led daily protests demanding that the government reveal what it knew about the foreign operations in their territory. The political pressure intensified when investigative journalists began arriving from South Africa and international news organizations. Sarah found herself caught between her scientific mission and the growing media circus. Every statement was scrutinized, every finding analyzed for its political implications. The story was becoming front-page news across Africa, with headlines demanding to know who had poisoned Botswana's children. The turning point came when Moses Kelepil, the environmental inspector, provided Sarah with photographs he had secretly taken during his earlier investigation. The images clearly showed industrial equipment, protective suits bearing corporate logos, and systematic drilling operations. Most importantly, they showed license plates on vehicles that could be traced through government databases. That evening, as Sarah prepared her next report for WHO headquarters, she received an unexpected visitor. A well-dressed man identifying himself as Robert van der Merwe, representing concerned international business interests, requested a private meeting. His message was delivered with polite but unmistakable menace. The investigation was attracting unwanted attention from powerful parties who preferred to resolve the situation through alternative channels. Dr. Mitchell, there are significant economic and political interests at stake here, van der Merwe explained with a cold smile. Perhaps it would be wise to focus on treating the sick, rather than pursuing investigations that might prove unproductive. Sarah's response was immediate and unwavering. She informed the visitor that any attempts to interfere with a WHO investigation would be reported to international authorities and could constitute crimes against humanity. As van der Merwe departed, his parting words chilled her. "Doctor, you're very far from home, and Botswana can be a dangerous place for outsiders who ask too many questions." That night, as Sarah reviewed security protocols with her team, she realized that their investigation had crossed a line from medical emergency into something far more dangerous. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they prepared to confront not just a health crisis, but powerful forces willing to kill to protect their secrets. The emergency meeting in Botswana's capital city of Gaborone felt more like a war council than a medical briefing. President Ketumile Masire himself had called for the gathering after international pressure mounted, following leaked reports of environmental terrorism on Botswanan soil. The conference room in the State House was filled with tension as government ministers, international diplomats, health officials, and intelligence personnel prepared to hear Dr. Sarah Mitchell's complete findings. Sarah stood before the assembled officials with a thick folder of evidence that represented weeks of dangerous investigation. The death toll had risen to 47 people, with hundreds more suffering from severe health complications that would likely plague them for life. But her team had uncovered something far more sinister than anyone had initially suspected. "Honorable President, distinguished delegates," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the weight of her revelations. "Our investigation has revealed that the contamination in rural Botswana was not an accident, but part of a systematic illegal rare earth mining operation conducted by a consortium of international corporations operating without permits or environmental safeguards." The room erupted in murmurs as she presented aerial photographs, chemical analysis reports, and financial documents that traced the criminal enterprise. The operation had been sophisticated, using advanced extraction techniques that left minimal surface evidence while maximizing toxic contamination of groundwater systems. The perpetrators had chosen Botswana specifically because of its vast uninhabited regions and limited environmental monitoring capabilities. Minister of Minerals, Energy and Water Resources, Ponachego Kedikilwe leaned forward intently as Sarah explained the technical details. "Dr. Mitchell, are you suggesting that foreign entities deliberately poisoned our water supplies for profit?" "Mr. Minister, the evidence is overwhelming," Sarah replied, activating a projector that displayed contamination maps overlaid with corporate financial records. "The companies involved extracted millions of dollars worth of rare earth elements, while dumping toxic waste directly into aquifer systems that serve dozens of rural communities. They knew the health consequences and proceeded anyway." The international implications became clear when Sarah revealed that the rare earth elements extracted from Botswana had been sold to electronics manufacturers in multiple countries, generating enormous profits while the mining sites were abandoned, with no cleanup efforts. The corporate network included front companies registered in tax havens with financial backing traced to investment funds in London, Hong Kong, and New York. Dr. James Harrison from WHO presented the medical evidence that supported criminal charges. The specific toxins found in patient blood samples match exactly with the chemical signatures of the illegal mining waste. "We have documented proof that the contamination was deliberate," and that the perpetrators were aware of the lethal consequences to local populations. But the most shocking revelation came when Sarah presented intelligence gathered by Moses Kelapile and corroborated by international investigators. The illegal mining operation had received tacit support from corrupt officials within Botswana's own government. Bank records showed suspicious payments to several mid-level bureaucrats who had provided false permits and blocked legitimate environmental inspections. The room fell silent as President Masir processed the implications. His own government had been infiltrated and used as a tool in an international conspiracy that had killed his citizens. The political ramifications extended far beyond health policy into questions of national sovereignty and institutional integrity. Intelligence. Reports revealed that the criminal organization behind the operation had conducted similar activities in other African countries, always targeting remote regions with limited government oversight. Botswana was not their first victim, merely the latest in a pattern of environmental colonialism that exploited Africa's resources while exporting the health consequences to vulnerable populations. The pressure for immediate action was enormous, but the challenges were equally daunting. The criminals had covered their tracks expertly, using legal loopholes and jurisdictional complications to avoid accountability. Many of the key players were protected by diplomatic immunity or operated from countries with limited extradition agreements. Sarah's team had identified the need for immediate emergency measures to protect the affected populations. Mr. President, we need to establish emergency medical treatment centers, implement long-term health monitoring programs, and begin environmental cleanup operations that could take decades to complete, she explained. The cost will be enormous, but the alternative is watching entire communities slowly die from preventable diseases. The international community's response was swift but complicated. European Union officials promised financial support for cleanup efforts, but were reluctant to pursue criminal charges that might implicate European corporations. The United States offered technical assistance, but made clear that American business interests must be protected. China, a major consumer of rare earth elements, remained notably silent about the revelations. As the meeting concluded, President Masir made a decision that would define his legacy. Standing before the assembled officials, he declared that Botswana would pursue justice regardless of international pressure or economic consequences. Our children are dying because foreign criminals saw African lives as expendable, he stated firmly. We will hold them accountable through every legal means available, and we will not be silenced by economic threats or diplomatic pressure. That evening, as Sarah prepared to brief international media outlets, she reflected on how the investigation had evolved from a medical mystery into a story of environmental justice with global implications. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as the world learned the truth about what had happened in the Kalahari Desert, and powerful interests prepared to fight back against demands for accountability and justice. The international press conference held at the Gaborone International Convention Center marked a turning point in what media outlets were now calling the Kalahari Conspiracy. Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood at the podium flanked by President Masir, CHU Director General Dr. Hiroshi Nakajima, and representatives from multiple international law enforcement agencies. The world's attention was focused on the small southern African nation, as details of one of the most egregious environmental crimes in modern history were revealed to the global public. Camera flashes illuminated the room as Sarah presented the damning evidence her team had assembled. Satellite imagery showed the systematic destruction of pristine wilderness areas. Chemical analysis proved deliberate contamination of water supplies, and financial records exposed a criminal network spanning 4 continents. The rare earth mining operation had been more extensive and damaging than anyone had initially realized, affecting not just Botswana, but neighboring countries as well. The evidence shows that this criminal enterprise treated African lives as completely expendable, Sarah explained to the international media. They extracted resources worth over $200 million while knowingly poisoning water supplies that served thousands of people. The death toll continues to rise, and the environmental damage will persist for generations. The corporate response was swift and predictable. Legal teams representing the implicated companies immediately went on the offensive, questioning the validity of the evidence and suggesting that the contamination might have natural causes. Press statements claimed that any mining activities in the region had been conducted legally and with full environmental safeguards, despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Meanwhile, Dr. Lisa Chen from the CDC presented the latest medical findings that painted an even grimmer picture of the long-term consequences. Our ongoing health assessments show that children exposed to these toxins are developing learning disabilities, respiratory problems, and immune system deficiencies at rates never before documented, she reported. We're dealing with a public health catastrophe that will require decades of specialized medical care. The political ramifications were immediate and far-reaching. Several European Parliament members called for emergency sessions to discuss corporate accountability in Africa, while environmental activists organized protests outside corporate headquarters in London, New York, and Hong Kong. The story dominated international headlines, with public outrage growing as details of the cover-up emerged. But the criminals were not prepared to surrender without a fight. Within hours of the press conference, Sarah began receiving death threats through encrypted channels. Her hotel room was searched by unknown intruders, and members of her investigation team reported being followed by suspicious individuals. The message was clear. Powerful interests were willing to use violence to protect themselves from accountability. The breakthrough in identifying the criminal leadership came from an unexpected source. Kaletso Ramphele, the geology student whose research had provided crucial early evidence, had continued her investigation with the passion of someone seeking justice for her poisoned homeland. Working with international cybersecurity experts, she had uncovered encrypted communications between corporate executives that revealed the true scope of their criminal enterprise. The intercepted messages showed that the contamination of Botswana's water supplies had been discussed at the highest corporate levels, with executives calculating the financial benefits of illegal dumping versus the costs of proper waste disposal. Most damning were communications that showed they had specifically chosen to operate in Africa because they believed African governments were too weak to hold them accountable, and African lives were not valued by the international community. President Masir's response to these revelations was historic. In an unprecedented move, he announced that Botswana would withdraw from several international trade agreements and pursue criminal charges against the corporate executives in every jurisdiction where they held citizenship or assets. "We will show the world that African sovereignty means something," he declared in a televised address to the nation. "No one can poison our children and hide behind corporate structures or diplomatic immunity." The international legal battle that followed was complex and expensive, but it received crucial support from unexpected quarters. Environmental law firms in multiple countries offered pro bono representation, while investigative journalists continued, uncovering evidence of similar operations in other African nations. The case became a symbol of the broader struggle between corporate power and environmental justice. Sarah found herself at the center of a global movement that extended far beyond the original health crisis. Environmental activists, human rights organizations, and legal reform advocates rallied around the Botswana case as an opportunity to establish precedents for corporate accountability in cross-border environmental crimes. The young epidemiologist who had simply wanted to treat sick children had become a reluctant but determined symbol of resistance against environmental colonialism. The pressure on the implicated corporations intensified as consumer boycotts spread across multiple countries. Electronics manufacturers who had purchased the illegally extracted rare earth elements faced public relations disasters as activists demanded accountability throughout the supply chain. Stock prices plummeted as investors recognized the long-term legal and reputational risks associated with the criminal enterprise. As the fifth month of the crisis concluded, Sarah reflected on how the investigation had exposed not just a criminal conspiracy, but the systemic vulnerabilities that made such crimes possible. The case had revealed how corporate structures, jurisdictional complications, and international indifference created opportunities for exploitation that treated African lives as expendable resources. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the legal battle intensified and powerful interests prepared for a final desperate attempt to escape accountability. But tonight, As Sarah looked out over the lights of Gaborone, she felt a growing confidence that justice might finally be within reach for the children of the Kalahari who had suffered so much for others' greed. 2 years after the first mysterious cases appeared in the villages of the Kalahari, Dr. Sarah Mitchell returned to Ganzi for a very different kind of visit. The temporary medical center had been replaced by a permanent health facility funded by international compensation agreements, and the red earth that had once been contaminated was slowly healing under careful environmental restoration efforts. But the true victory was not in the buildings or the cleanup operations. It was in the precedent that had been set for environmental justice worldwide. The legal battle had been long and complex, but ultimately successful beyond anyone's expectations. The International Criminal Court had issued arrest warrants for 17 corporate executives, marking the first time environmental crimes in Africa had been prosecuted at the highest international level. More importantly, courts in London, New York, and Hong Kong had frozen billions of dollars in assets pending restitution payments to the affected communities. Gosi Tobago, the village elder who had first welcomed Sarah during the darkest days of the crisis, now served on the International Oversight Committee managing the cleanup and compensation efforts. His grandson Thabo, the 8-year-old boy Sarah had first examined, was now a healthy 10-year-old attending a new school built with funds recovered from the criminal enterprise. The sight of children playing safely in areas that had once been contaminated represented the most meaningful victory of all. Dr. Mfo Mogomotsi, the local physician who had worked alongside Sarah during the emergency, had used his experiences to establish the Kalahari Institute for Environmental Health, which now served as a regional center for monitoring and responding to similar threats. His work had attracted international recognition and funding, transforming a remote clinic into a world-class research facility that would protect future generations. The financial settlements had exceeded $12 billion, making it the largest environmental restitution case in African history. But more important than the money was the precedent established for holding multinational corporations accountable for crimes against vulnerable populations. Legal experts around the world now referred to the Botswana Doctrine as a landmark in international environmental law. Sarah's role in the investigation had transformed her from a field epidemiologist into one of the world's leading experts on environmental crime and corporate accountability. She had testified before the United Nations, advised governments on environmental security, and written extensively about the intersection of health, environment, and human rights. But she never forgot that her motivation had always been the children who suffered while powerful interests prioritized profits over human life. Keletso Ramphele, the geology student whose research had provided crucial evidence, had completed her doctorate and now directed the Environmental Crimes Investigation Unit at the University of Botswana. Her innovative techniques for tracking illegal mining operations had been adopted by law enforcement agencies worldwide, and her work continued to expose similar criminal enterprises across Africa and beyond. The corporate executives who had orchestrated the conspiracy faced varying fates depending on their jurisdictions and the strength of international cooperation. Several were serving lengthy prison sentences, while others remained fugitives in countries without extradition agreements. But their business empire had been completely dismantled, and the rare earth elements industry had been forced to adopt unprecedented transparency and environmental safeguards. President Masir's courageous decision to prioritize justice over economic pressure had transformed Botswana's international standing. The country was now recognized as a leader in environmental protection and corporate accountability, attracting investment from organizations that valued ethical governance and sustainable development. The crisis that had threatened to destroy communities had ultimately strengthened the nation's sovereignty and moral authority. The health impacts continued to require ongoing attention and resources. Dr. Lisa Chen had established a permanent CDC liaison office in Gaborone to monitor long-term health effects and ensure that affected individuals received appropriate care throughout their lives. Medical advances developed specifically for treating rare earth element poisoning had benefited patients worldwide, turning a tragedy into a source of medical innovation. Environmental restoration efforts had progressed beyond expectations, with contaminated areas showing remarkable recovery under intensive remediation programs. The combination of advanced cleanup technologies and traditional ecological knowledge had created innovative approaches to environmental healing that were being replicated in other contaminated regions globally. As Sarah walked through the village, where her investigation had begun, she was struck by the resilience and strength of the communities that had survived such unprecedented betrayal. Children who had been desperately ill were now healthy and thriving. Their families had received compensation that ensured their future security, and their communities had been strengthened by the knowledge that justice was possible even against the most powerful interests. The evening concluded with a traditional celebration in Sarah's honor, recognizing her role in bringing truth and justice to the Kalahari. As she sat with families whose lives had been forever changed by corporate greed and environmental crime, she reflected on how their struggle had become a symbol of hope for vulnerable communities worldwide. The Kalahari conspiracy had ended not with the criminals escaping accountability, but with unprecedented global recognition that environmental crimes against African communities would no longer be tolerated. The precedent established in Botswana's Red Earth had created new international standards that protected communities from corporate exploitation and environmental terrorism. Under the brilliant stars of the Kalahari sky, Sarah understood that this victory belonged not to any individual investigator or official, but to the courage and determination of ordinary people who had refused to accept that their lives and their children's futures were expendable. Their struggle had changed the world, proving that justice and accountability were possible even against the most powerful and well-connected criminal enterprises.